So for our agenda today, we really kind of structured it around a couple general themes. First, we're going to do a brief overview. GDPR is now 2 months in, and I think most of us have a little bit more than just a passing knowledge, but we'll do a little bit of a high-level overview, and we'll also talk a little bit about what's happened over the last 2 months since the deadline of May 25th has passed. We'll then segue in to describe some significant considerations in terms of some of the things that corporations and other folks that are subject to the regulation need to be aware of in terms of building out business processes to address some of their compliance issues with the GDPR. And then we'll present an emerging technology solution around a broad category of offering called auto classification that we think addresses some of those requirements of the GDPR that are easy to implement and something that I think we'll be seeing developed out into the future. And then we'll wrap things up with some concluding thoughts and some takeaways for all of you to consider. All told, we're probably going to spend about 45 minutes with the discussion. Again, informal. We have a smallish group today, so to the extent that we need to answer questions, happy to do so. So on to introductions. My name's Thomas Bonk. I'm Vice President of Global Professional Services here at Epic. I have general responsibility over our information governance and forensic collection practices across the globe. And I'll hand it over to my two esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves. Sandy, why don't you go?
Sure. So, hi, I'm Sandy Surkis. I'm the President and CEO of Valora Technologies. We are strategic partners with Epic, and specifically, they've been very helpful at having us exposed to kind of a worldwide presence of clients. We're more of a technology provider, so I'm going to be covering the technological aspects of auto classification and kind of meeting GDPR requirements with technology. So that's my role in this.
Good. And I'm Jeff Jacobs. I'm the Senior Director of our Information Governance Consulting practice and advise clients on information governance compliance and different ways of approaching that, including the use of technologies, and have a background in litigation matters as well.
All right. So let's get right to it. And Jeff, let's start with you. Again, let's start with a high-level overview of GDPR, and then maybe you can interject with some highlights of what's happened over the last couple months, some things that you feel are particularly important in terms of focus points for folks that are subject to this regulation.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. So, as Tom said, the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation in Europe, has been effective for 2 months, and as we speak, 2 months and 1 day today. And what's somewhat interesting is that already there are complaints being filed against a number of parties throughout Europe. A recent survey by the IAPP indicated that some 5,000 complaints have been filed with various governmental data protection authorities just in the past 2 months. And it's interesting perhaps to see where some of those are coming from. As you might imagine, over 1,100 of them were from the UK, and then slightly fewer numbers from Poland, Ireland, the Czech Republic, and France. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, some of you may recognize the name of Max Schrems. He was the person who brought a complaint that brought down the safe harbor regime between Europe and the United States that provided for cross-border transfer of information and particularly personal information and data. But just within minutes after the effective date, he and his organization, the NOYB, which stands for None of Your Business, filed complaints against the likely suspects, so against Facebook, Alphabet, Google, Instagram and WhatsApp, and in several different countries, and basically challenging their consent approaches, suggesting that they did not comply with the informed consent requirements of the GDPR.
So he wasted no time. 12:01 on the 25th, he was locked and loaded.
It was
and
clear
ready to
that he
go,
wanted to be first out of the box to take the lead in this area. And so, let's just talk a little bit about kind of what GDPR requires. And for those of you who were familiar with the previous 1995 data protection directive in Europe, this is really a follow-on. So the problem with the previous directive, which did impose requirements on controllers and processors of data, and we'll talk a little bit about exactly what that involves. Basically the problem there was that each country in Europe had the opportunity to define the requirements on its own. The directive did set kind of a baseline, but then each country could do its own. So it was kind of a patchwork of varying regulatory requirements that ultimately became unworkable, and there was a consensus not only among the regulators, but also among the companies in Europe and multinational companies, including those in the United States that operated in Europe, that you really needed something more uniform. And so this was the kind of the impetus for the GDPR, which does set a European-wide standard for what needs to be done from a consent standpoint, and imposing uniform penalties and enforcement criteria for the regulation of data privacy.
So in other words, Jeff, there's not a lot of new news or new stuff that was added. This is more of a consolidation and aggregation, a normalization, so that there was uniformity across the European Union, right?
Absolutely.
That was the major goals, right?
Absolutely. The buzzword that's been used is harmonization.
Yeah.
So that has been was the objective. And so, what the big difference is, and I think it's important to highlight them, is that you do have have tighter deadlines now for responding to various types of users' requests for information about the data that is being processed, and particularly you have more stringent penalties, and that's gotten quite a bit of publicity. So the penalties for relatively minor violations of the GDPR are up to 2% of a company's worldwide revenue, or 10 million euros, whichever is greater. And then the most serious penalties go up to 4% of worldwide revenue, or 20 million euros. And again, for some of these huge technology companies like a Facebook or a Google and so forth, when you talk about 2% or 4% of revenue, that's a pretty significant matter. One thing that's interesting, those of you who follow earnings reports may have seen yesterday, Facebook reported earnings and attributed its somewhat underperformance in Europe in part at least to the cost of GDPR compliance. So it is a significant impact on many organizations, and that's really why I think, need to be concerned about it here in the United States. It's applicable, really, for those of us in the United States to any organization that is either doing business in and having clients and operations in Europe, or that has any European citizen employees. And so basically, if a company is doing business and collecting information on its customers of a personal nature, and that could be as simple as collecting certainly any financial information, but also any information like email addresses and contact information, things of that sort. Basically, you are being caught under the jurisdictional requirements.
So I will say a couple things on that one, or on those comments. This certainly got all the headlines leading up to the May 25th date, the penalty piece, right? The up to 4% of worldwide revenue. But the key phrase in that is the words "up to," and I always kind of chuckle a little bit because I'm a parent, and if I tried to tell my 6-year-old you're going to be punished for up to 10 years if you don't clean your room, I mean, I could say that, right? But what does that really mean in real life? The other thing I want to just report from some specific experience that I had. I was in London for a trip 2 weeks ago. One thing you really notice is when you're on the internet and you're going to normal websites like ESPN.com or NewYorkTimes.com, you're immediately met with a splash screen that says you will give consent. This is every time you go to those websites without fail. You have to go through this consent form routine, which gets annoying after a time. And there's some sites that, for instance, I'm from Chicago, and I tried to keep in touch with the ChicagoTribune.com, and that site had a big splash screen that says we're in issues trying to rationalize the new GDPR rules and regulations, and for now our website is not accessible in Europe. So those are some tangible early things that are happening, at least from a browsing perspective of the internet. So.
Yep.
All right.
So I think if we, let's look at sort of, kind of a typical use case, and again, assume that you're an organization that does collect some type of personal data, and you're using the information to serve customers, fulfill your business purposes, or indeed just to administer your day-to-day business. And have various transactions with your employees, including paying them. Just that type of information, if it involves operations in Europe or European citizens, is going to bring you under the purview of the new regulation. One of the key things here is that in order to do that, you do need to have the data owner's consent. And it needs to be informed consent. So as many of you know, I'm sure just about everyone in the room, when they were employed, had to sign something that said that they waive any personal privacy right in their information. Your employer has essentially unlimited access to that, the ability to use your information and anything you do on the company's premises or using company equipment, computers, if you have a company cell phone, is going to be basically the company's. Under the GDPR and again the previous directive, that actually is a personal right. And so in order to have the employer or the person with whom you're doing business use that information, you have to have the opportunity to consent. And most importantly, and a little bit different in the GDPR, is that you have the unlimited and perpetual right to withdraw that consent. So even if you have consented at any time, you have the ability to say, no, I've changed my mind, and no longer can you use that information.
Does the consent have to be narrowly defined, or is it a blanket consent? Whatever you want to use this for, go ahead. Or does it have to be, for the purposes of maintaining my employment records, or for payroll purposes or tax purposes?
Yeah, I think for an employee relationship, it can be relatively general. Can say, for any reasons necessary for my employment, but particularly in a customer type of relationship, it actually has to be specific in order to meet the informed consent requirement. And also tailored as narrowly as possible. So the new rules do require that any use of this information not only has to be disclosed, but also has to be narrowly defined to be as unintrusive as possible. And one area where this comes up is what's known as the Data Subject Access Right, or DSAR. So this basically gives any data subject the right to ask whether an organization has any of their personal data, ask them what they're doing with it, who else they've shared it with, and basically provide the opportunity to get a copy of it. And so this is, and it also only gives a 30-day period within which to provide this information. So this is really introducing a significant compliance issue for many organizations. And in fact, many of the complaints that actually have come in and been filed during the last 30 days, which was 30 days after the effective date, have to do with failure of organizations to have provided that 30-day response. So one of the things that a lot of organizations are finding is that if they do not have a good handle on where their information is already located, it really presents quite a challenge in order to find the information and be able to respond to these subject access requests in a timely manner. This is an area where having a good data map in place is really critical and almost mandatory, because if you do find yourself in an enforcement kind of a situation, you're going to have to be able to show what steps you took to comply. And again, in order to try to minimize any potential penalty. One of the ways you can do that is by showing that you did go through the effort of creating a data map and using it, and again, sort of rely on the complexity of your organization and the difficulties of finding all the sources of information that are relevant.
So wait, this sounds familiar. This sounds a little bit like I'm hearing eDiscover here, guys. I don't know. Sandy, does this sound familiar to you?
It sure does.
Yeah.
But I'll wait my turn.
All right.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next slide. What and this can go to both of you. What U.S. sectors and what types of companies are most likely, going to face GDPR scrutiny? Do we know that yet? What constitutes a risky data or risky data management that folks should seek to avoid and perhaps build business processes around to mitigate?
Sure. So clearly, most at risk are the companies that engage in multinational operations. E-commerce companies, obviously, because you're going to be collecting information about customers, whether current or potential, throughout Europe, and then data brokers, analytics firms, and indeed providers of things like electronic discovery services, people who do data collection and processing in connection with litigation or investigatory matters are going to be, I think, most not only at risk but also under the greatest scrutiny by the regulators. And so to the extent that, I think the higher the profile you have, again, I think it's not by accident that many of these initial complaints have been filed against the large technology data collectors and users like Facebook and Google and so forth. But it's going to be the Amazons and people like that as well that will be subject to the greatest scrutiny.
Yeah, the huge aggregators, the huge marketers. I think something that I've seen in attending various industry conferences, thinking back to the Georgetown conference last November and some other conferences early in 2018, the consensus sentiment is, generally let's wait and see how things go. Certainly, I think the early on focus is going to be at the large, high-profile companies. What still is the great unknown is, how far, what is the enforcement going to look like for what types of infractions, what types of companies are going to be vulnerable to enforcement, how this is all going to sort of shake out, over time. I expect that this is going to be a slow burn, and we're going to start to then see some high-profile cases, both with the usual suspects and maybe some folks that we didn't suspect were going to be targets are going to start to emerge, and we'll see how everyone reacts. And hopefully, some of the things I think Epic and Valora and others are working on, and we're going to share with you all, are some ideas around business process, some investments in technologies to help address some of the specific facets of GDPR compliance. So,
right. One of the things that is important to keep in mind is that even though the rules are uniform across Europe, in fact, the enforcement mechanisms are country by country. So basically, you have complaints filed with the data protection authorities, with each of the individual, the 28 countries that make up the European Economic Zone, and a few affiliates. But in fact, it may be up to each country to actually figure out how to enforce and how to impose these penalties. So I think it remains to be seen how that's going to affect things. So I think it's important, again, just as a compliance matter, to probably figure out what kind of personal information you have and are dealing with. Again, as I mentioned, data mapping is a good place to start for all of that. And then make sure that you are documenting your consent usage. One of the things that is in the GDPR is the requirement upon request, and it can either be in response to a complaint, or data protection authorities can basically do audits and have the right to ask you to prove that you have obtained consents for the data subject information that you are holding and processing.
One of the things that we're seeing as service provider, the 2 months in, is we're seeing some clients of ours, whether it's a law firm client on behalf of their corporate client or corporate clients coming directly to us, in looking for solutions on how to respond to DSARs, right? And some of the projects we've worked on is we've, again, through consultation and working with the client around their goals. Some of the solutions and workflows that we've implemented are very similar to e-discovery and document review and production, right? You take the data is collected for a specific custodian or subject. You process the data, you build a database, you review data for things like personal and sensitive and data that potentially is privileged or not to be disclosed, and you ultimately produce a report to the requesting party. That's a pretty low-tech solution that probably is not what we expect is going to be long-term, where we think folks are going to be making investments in addressing this problem. Sandy, I know you're the technologist of the group, and you have some really kind of strong feelings as to what are perhaps some stronger technology plays and solutions that are available to help folks put a layer of automation in the corporate enterprise, especially if they're going to be receiving these types of requests and have to do compliance type activities to the GDPR. So what are let's segue
actually, if I could just interject one other thing. The one other significant thing that the GDPR does is provide the so-called right to be forgotten, or the right to have your personal information deleted entirely from a processor. And so the whole concept of doing defensible deletions that can enable you to delete upon request personal information while retaining the information that you do have to hold for regulatory or litigation hold purposes is the other use that we're finding is more and more coming to the fore, and I think that sort of the big question is, how do you identify that information so that you can comply both with the either the subject access request or the request for deletion. And I think to an area that I will hand off to Sandy to address on how that process can be automated.
And Sandy, please don't tell us we're going to be drawing rectangles in relativity around people's names and social security numbers and credit cards, because if we're doing that 2 years from now, I'm going to be like, we're on the wrong track. So.
So I'll pick up on something that you said, Tom, which is when you use kind of an e-discovery mindset, typically the point of view is the custodian. So the data is organized or conceived by custodian. When you're in a GDPR or a data privacy context, that is not necessarily the point of view. It's very often the consumer. Okay, so if a customer of such and such company wants to know what data do you have on me, data is not going to be organized by that customer. There's no such thing as a customer custodian within the enterprise data. So if you kind of know the concept of like a pivot table in Excel, that same sort of notion, you need to have a different frame of reference. So the frame of reference might be that person who's submitting the DSAR and saying, I want to know what you have on me. So it could be a consumer, it could be a supplier, it could be an employee. Pretty much anyone who's a European citizen has a right to ask those questions. And not only of European companies, but of American companies. It's sort of like a birthright in a way because they're a European citizen. So the frame of reference for the data collection and analysis has to be their point of view. So what does that mean if, I'm Sandy Serkis and let's just fantasize that, I don't know, I'm a French citizen for the moment, and because I like France, and I call up Facebook and say, well, what do you have on me? That is a pretty broad request. What that means kind of within the confines of GDPR is, what personal information do you have on me itself? Do you have, let's say I'm a joint citizen, my social security number or my European citizen, whatever France uses for an identification number. So something very specific like that. But do you also have my consent? So there's kind of two layers of information holding on somebody. There's the information itself. There's actually more than two. There's the consent to use that. And then there's the organization's essentially stated goals in how they're going to use that. That's where the consent is supposed to derive from. So if the organization changes how they intend to use that, like, it might be once upon a time, I'm just going to fulfill the order for this customer. But then later on, marketing gets a hold of that and says, maybe we should do some data mining. There are good technologies for that. And that's a different use. And so now the consent loop is supposed to go again. So that's almost like a third order. And then there's kind of a fourth order, which is if that data is being aggregated, this is the data processor label. For some other purpose, maybe being sold to another entity, like your mortgage info being sold to a credit agency or something like that, then that's even a fourth layer. So there are all these kind of layers of nuance that all drive off of what does this information say? And it's not really the point of view of custodian. It's not even necessarily the point of view, like a data map would typically be, this department stores data in this fashion, or sometimes it's more repository or silo-based. Email is stored in this fashion. Those are kind of moving targets. And so data mapping is certainly a good exercise. Everybody familiar with data mapping, or should we explain what that is? Yeah, no, okay. Yes, Carlton. The problem with data mapping is that the minute you map it, the next day you could be out of sync with yourself. And that's a dangerous kind of risk zone. So some of the technologies that are in play, it's important to think about it not as a kind of one and done. Sometimes e-discovery has that element because you're talking about a fixed period of time and a fixed set of files. When you're talking about data privacy, you're talking about ongoing and all files as they change. Okay, so you need to have analytical tools that can tell you not just what did I have, what do I have, and tomorrow, what will or should I have, okay? And it's kind of keeping in sync with the data as it changes. So
auto classification, tell us
Exactly.
what that is, what
Yeah.
that technology is, and how that might help in this,
Sure.
for these business cases.
Auto classification is essential. Let's start with classification, okay? So classification is essentially kind of like metadata on steroids. It is tagged or attribute data about file content that will say all kinds of useful things like what kind of document or purpose was this content created for? Who wrote it? Who owns it? What kind of keywords or topics are present? This gets into where we're kind of dancing on records and information strategy now. So what is the appropriate data lifecycle management of this document? How long should we keep it, and why, and under what security? So those are all like tags that would be counted as classification of data. So auto-classification is using technology to determine those tags instead of, God help us, having people do it, because that is the world's most thankless job. Yep. So auto-classification is using software and using things like machine learning and AI and all the buzzwords to automatically be able to essentially crawl content, a little bit like what Google does a little, and add these tags to it and keep that up to date in real time so that the tags can then be queried or utilized, here's the second piece, with a rules engine, so you know what you have at all times, how it should be stored, whether it should be stored, and then you can play with those rules when the DSAR comes in. Please forget me. Okay, let's go find everything related to her and delete it. Within, unless it's under legal hold, right? We get into all this.
Yeah.
That's our next webinar.
All right, yeah, exactly. So, all right, so
Okay,
a little
so-
bit more,
Sure, so
yeah.
I jumped ahead here. Auto-classification is really two pieces. There's this rich metadata, this metadata creation or extraction. And for those of you who are e-discovery folks, it's quite a lot more metadata than you would typically be used to in e-discovery. Upwards, usually about a dozen or so fields. You can get very fancy. There are hundreds and hundreds of potential fields available, not just PII or PHI. And then that gets combined with a rules engine. A rules engine is essentially a kind of a hierarchical if-then structure. We're going to get into it, so I think I have a slide on that in here to kind of explain what rules do and how. The other big piece is that auto-classification is kind of what we call middleware. And what that means is that it sits between all the different data locations and is aware of all of them. So it's not like you just have one thing for your email and another thing for your file shares and yet another thing on the cloud. It's kind of like a pan silo awareness.
So let's, how does it work?
Here's how it works.
Walk us through sort of
Sure.
the main
So-
high-level steps.
The first step is a lot like e-discovery. There's a notion of processing. One of the big differences between like auto-classification or data privacy analysis and e-discovery is typically working on a copy of data. Somebody went through a collections effort, made a copy, and now it's stored offline or out of active use on relativity or whatever else. When you're talking about GDPR, data privacy, you're on live data, almost always. I mean, you might be on a copy, but more often than not, you're on the live enterprise data, which is changing. And so you tend not to do an ingestion technique, and it's more what they call processing in place. So the software does like a crawl, leaves the files where they are in the enterprise system, but is just kind of visits and goes away. That's called processing in place. It's very important for these types of solutions because it's typically a huge amount of, 400, 500 terabytes of data. You don't really want to be making copies of that and sending it around. Much easier to bring the software to the data. So that's what happens here. Like e-discovery, it's mostly text analytics, content analytics. That's the dominant technique. And then the next kind of real step, once you get to text one way or another, is to have this tagging effort, whether you call it indexing, coding, tagging, attributes. It's a little bit like DNA sequencing. You take a blood sample, sort of the file, and you know everything there is to know about its entire history.
And it's automated. It's not like folks are doing these tags. Again,
Yes,
we're
this
trying
is
to
all
avoid
automated.
the manual processes, right?
Yes. So what you get to from having a kind of a text rendition of the content is you get to this fielded data set of attributes. And this whole set of data becomes that metadata record. So every file inside the organization has kind of like a metadata sidebar that tells what that file is, all the things you'd expect. When was it last modified? How was it modified? Did it change status in any way, et cetera? And then once you have this kind of metadata record, now you can manipulate your content without having to read it, search it, touch it. You now have this metadata way of managing. So then that takes you into the final step, which is disposition. Things that tend to go together nicely around data privacy and GDPR would be, for example, essentially getting the data house in order in general, not just regarding personal information. While you're at it, wouldn't it be fun to identify what's usually called ROT, redundant, obsolete, trivial? So if you have, for example, most organizations have about 30 to 40% ROT present. As long as you're going to be analyzing the content anyway to figure out what you have, where it is, what's subject to GDPR, how to manage it, why not clean it up while you're at it, especially if you have duplicative content. So those are some of the things that go together, and a good example of using a rule structure to organize and disposit content. So that's what happens here. Sometimes, as part of these efforts, it's not just tagging. Sometimes there's a data migration step, like if you are, let's say your organization, you've said to people, yes, we're collecting your personal data, but we're going to be storing it and no one will have access and whatever, then you had better comply with that. And so one of the sort of end results of these efforts, not only find the data, tag the data, but literally move it to that safe environment, that protected, security protected environment. So
And
that's the migration.
My favorite slide is where you're going to help us sort of a high level see how this
Sure.
this all works. So this is.
This is Tom's favorite slide. So, all right. So one of the big things that happens here, what we're really talking about, this is less for an e-discovery audience, but you will find yourselves in this conversation kind of butting up against IT and butting up against records. They tend to view the world through what's called an ECM, or an enterprise content management system, which if you're familiar with relativity is like a little baby one. It takes all the litigation things and kind of holds it within its confines. That's an ECM. So there are ECMs in the larger picture. You know some of them. If you've ever used OpenText, or if some of you are in law firms, you've ever used iManage. Those are ECMs. And the idea is that the data belongs in there and all the tagging, everything happens within that environment, but nobody operates like this. We operate like this. You have some data in the ECM or the DMS. You have some in email. Now it's all up in Dropbox. We're all over the map. And if your job is to get your hands around the data, and more importantly, to certify that you have properly complied, then you have to be able to hit them all. This is a modern day data store. It's kind of a hodgepodge. And then, so that's sort of the data where it's stored. This is the data how it's used. All these other kind of reasons and purposes for getting at data. GDPR really just one of them, but there's lots of others, litigation, another good example. So what you want in the center is a traffic cop. This is that middleware concept. And that's where our product actually, if you click one more time, Powerhouse comes in, because it's aware. It crawls all of them simultaneously. It knows them all, does that same tagging and rules analysis. And then if you're kind of into this, like I am, this whole technique is called content services. It's kind of a Gartner term they coined last year, where all the content is analyzed, aware, tagged, managed, and then served up to these use cases on demand. So here comes the DSAR up through here, says, excuse me, please forget everything about me. This is where it happens and takes care of all of it at once. So I won't get into the plugin.
All right.
All right.
So let's talk about a good way. A good place to start, when we advise our clients, oftentimes what we're seeing in our initial conversations is clients are just having a hard time understanding what are some low cost, some easy places for us to start. I know Jeff mentioned data mapping as a potential early solution.
Mm-hmm.
Makes a lot of sense, not only from a data privacy standpoint, but from an information governance, good practice, hygiene type standpoint. What are some other ideas? And this can be for both of you, actually.
in terms of where my
Yeah.
data
Or
live,
where to start. What are some solutions, some low-cost solutions on where organizations might be able to begin to build business processes to address GDPR compliance?
So I'll give you my favorite starting point, which is with data that is from people who've departed your organization, because that is the no man's land and nobody wants to touch that. So whether it's their old email, maybe it's just an image drive of everything that they had, or their file share, or their abandoned Microsoft SharePoint sites. Those are great places to start. One, nobody really owns them anymore and you won't get a lot of pushback. Two, nobody's going to complain because they've left the organization. And three, that's the most giant hole there is because nobody knows what's in there. Another one in that sort of same category is if there's M&A and people are inheriting data from the acquired organization. That you inherit the data, but none of the institutional knowledge that went with it. So whenever you have that situation, that's generally called data in flight. In other words, the data is moving for some reason. Technically, it might be the employee in flight, but the data is considered to be in flight.
A divestiture, retirement of legacy systems,
Yeah.
moving to the cloud, moving to Office 365, all those are prime events
Right.
to get your house in order, make an investment in technology and perhaps help with compliance and other benefits of the solutions. Right?
Yeah, I think any kind of decommissioning type event of legacy systems presents an opportunity, as well as just general. Again, there was a reference to a cleanup, but doing a defensible deletion initiative, just as it's a beneficial thing to do to reduce the amount of information you have to look at in an electronic discovery context. Likewise, the less you have to search, even with the advantage of using an auto classification approach, to the extent you've already done that sort of cleanup, it really will ease your ability to respond to DSAR requests or requests for deletion.
Yeah, there's kind of a notion. One of the things you want to look at is, to the best you can, try to gauge what you think your DSAR volume is going to be. Are you going to get one or two a year, or are you going to get one or two a minute? Because those are very, very different solutions. If you're getting one or two a year, then yeah, run a 95 million searches, pull what you need to, and good luck with that. If you're getting one or two a minute, then do not be doing that by hand, because you'd have to search all of those silos over and over. You want to get to an automated solution. And then, of course, there's everything in between. I'll just share with you guys a funny expression I coined yesterday, because I was trying to say, get your house in order and get your ducks in a row, and it came out as get your ducks in your house. So I kind of liked that.
Do that
So
too.
the goal is to get your ducks in your house.
All right, so and we talked about defining your use cases. We certainly spent a lot of time today talking about DSARs. What are some other, how do you tie it all together, the GDPR use cases to other information governance challenges, right, that auto classification might address?
Right, so there's a little bit of a sense, all of these can kind of happen simultaneously, and that is hugely beneficial because you're bringing together groups within the organization that might not have realized they were on the same side before. Legal, records, and IT. If you're in a law firm, knowledge management is going to play a role here, because these are all folks that have some sort of vested interest in data ducks getting in the house. So it depends kind of which use case is sort of driving. Right now, data privacy is driving a lot of the discussion and, yes, a lot of the expenditure because it's such a potential risk. But all these others are legitimate and can benefit from it. So if you're looking to kind of justify the expense or build an ROI, you're going to pick up benefit from all these other groups. IT's benefit or ROI is that removal of rot, because rot costs money to store and manage. So there's usually a straight up ROI right there. Legal, of course, is going to reduce and manage risk. I think everybody in here understands that. Records is finally going to have a way to deal with being in compliance with their own retention policy. pretty much everybody believes now information governance is a good idea. They've gone ahead and done the very first two things that you have to do for IG, which is do a data map and build a retention policy, and now they're completely not in compliance with their own retention policy. So this is a great way to kind of tie those up with a big bow, right this minute with GDPR kind of leading the charge.
Yeah, and I think also, certainly with the enormous number of data breaches that seem to be occurring, the security aspect of this, I think, needs to be emphasized as well. The opportunity to be able to use this kind of classification approach to identify information that needs to be secured, that requires special protection, and also to make sure that information that is commercially sensitive isn't leaving the building along with the ducks. Is important as well, because you don't want the ducks leading your most sensitive intellectual property and other proprietary information, to the river.
Actually, just to pick up on that, I have a lot of expressions. I had another one which was that email is the biggest sieve in your organization, because it really is. Anybody can email anything as an attachment to anybody else, and anything can come into you. If you've ever had a virus, coming in through email. That no longer has the top shelf data hole in your organization. Now it's Dropbox, okay, where you can upload whole swaths of content and make it available to whoever you shared it with or accidentally shared it with or what have you. So now that we have that, it's like kind of cowboy free-for-all in terms of data flowing, which really is absolutely against GDPR and data privacy legislation.
Any other thoughts in terms of ROI? I think you've covered some of this on our previous slide.
I think one of the challenges is always getting an organization to make the upfront investment to come into compliance with any kind of requirement. Very often there is an attitude of waiting to see whether it really becomes necessary. You may want to wait and find out whether, in fact, you're going to be getting a lot of these DSAR requests or other types of requests under the GDPR. But I think, as Sandy pointed out, there are a lot of affiliated benefits to taking this kind of approach, and very often it may well be the case that doing that will have benefits and a return on the relatively modest upfront investment that really should probably be undertaken, both just as a general good practice of information governance, as well as being able to comply with these GDPR requirements.
And I think we see as a long-term vision this process, like for instance, as we've been talking about DSAR as one of the primary use cases. We see the DSAR process pointing toward an entirely self-service model where if you're a subject, you can do your access request online via some sort of portal, and then everything's automated behind it in order for that person to get their information back. That's where we're headed. I don't know if the technology is quite caught up, but it's within reach, and there's a lot of folks, Valora being one of them, in working toward that end state. So I think in summation, our key takeaways today is, certainly I think most of awareness is key. Certainly the hype machine has been in full drive for now. I think we've been subjected to a good 9 months of major GDPR hype, and GDPR being the dominant sort of on the horizon type thing that is getting a lot of folks' attention. I think most of us and everybody, certainly if you're handling personal data and it's from European citizens and residents, need to be just generally aware of what the GDPR entails and doing what's necessary to prepare for complying to some of the issues that the GDPR requires. I'm in the information governance business. We talk to clients all day long about different information governance use cases. GDPR is just one more good reason, right, to make the investment, and you get all kinds of ancillary benefits, at least from our perspective, in making what I would consider modest investments in technology and process. And GDPR certainly is like the propellant, the accelerant right now, and the catalyst that's driving a lot of corporate enterprise action. And just another last key takeaway is there are technology solutions. Certainly we can do things like manual review and drawing boxes around information and sort of brute force type methods to comply and to things like subject access request or assess where personal and sensitive information exists within a corporate enterprise. But there are technology options that exist today, and those technology solutions are going to get better as we go along and as we define different specific use cases. So that's the conclusion of our presentation today. Is there any questions, comments, anything on your mind from the audience? We maybe have a minute or so to take.
I have one thing. So from a corporate perspective, do you feel like maybe that you have, I see this as two different types of potential people, kind of, people avant-garde who are thinking ahead, wanting to get the companies in order, and then the fear-based people, fear of litigation. People that sit in the middle, what do you think would be kind of a kick in the butt, so to speak, to kind of get them to start acting versus just talking?
I can think of two. I can think of it from the records is kind of in the middle of that. And if they are trying to comply with retention policies, either in e-discovery we call that litigation readiness,
right.
And in records we call that retention policy compliance. It's the same thing, which is getting things ready in case, God forbid, the thing happens. So that is where I think the middle ground is. If you have somebody that's either had enough litigation to feel the pain of having to invent the wheel every time, or if you have somebody in records records, by the way, has historically been only about paper. The electronic records universe dwarfs all paper records, and so there are organizations, I can speak to this one openly because we just won the city of Boston, has taken on its kind of agenda as a sort of just good data hygiene. Gee, we have all these requirements for data of our citizens for paper, we need to extend that to electronic. There's not a litigation, they're not particularly subject to GDPR, it's just a smart thing to do.
Yeah, I think one thing that sometimes is not observed as it should be is that a retention policy really has implicit a disposition policy, and I think in most organizations, the default policy is that everyone holds everything forever. It's just reality, and it's perhaps human nature or practice. But the fact is that a retention policy really requires that things, in fact, be disposed of at the end of that, or the policy itself really loses its validity. So I think making sure that happens, is certainly one of the benefits of this kind of approach.
I'll add one more thing to that. Again, this is more from the records side. Historically, meaning like in the last 2 years, what's been going on is this notion of, here's a retention policy, we'll educate everybody to that retention policy, by which we mean we'll publish it, and then leave it to everyone to kind of self-manage, self-enforce. And that basically does not hold water in any way. That is the easiest thing for an expert testimony to rip down. And so that is not really a viable solution to compliance. And I don't have, kind of case data I can just throw at you, but that will not hold water. It certainly won't hold water for a GDPR instance. It's the organization that is responsible for enforcing its policies, not the people.
All right.
I know we're, obviously only 2 months in, but as you've already said, Mad Max has already filed this lawsuit. So when do we have, any anticipated results of litigation or these fines that
Right. So, the question was, we're in the early stages, as I mentioned before. We've already had a number of complaints filed, thousands of them. When are we likely to see results? Get a better sense of what kind of penalties and enforcement approaches are going to be pursued by the data protection authorities. And it's hard to tell. Again, a lot of the data protection authorities, in fact, are just staffing up to try to deal with these. The number of complaints under the previous data protection directive was actually fairly limited. One thing that is going to encourage more complaints now is that previously DSARs required or permitted organizations to impose a handling fee to process them. The GDPR actually makes that free, so that you can file a complaint without having to pay a fee, or make a DSAR request without paying a fee. So again, it's just staffing up. My guess is it'll probably be at least another 3 to 4 months or more before we start getting any results from any of these data protection authorities. But again, we'll just have to wait and see how quickly they can process them. And I suspect there's a bit of a political force as well that will be driving particularly the complaints against the larger technology companies, the Google, the Facebook, Amazon, and so forth. So I suspect those will certainly be the first ones to be adjudicated one way or another.
And one of the more interesting sort of conflict points, and something that we're working on developing another webinar at a different date for, is how are companies going to resolve obligations that they have to United States discovery and other legal processes that may be in conflict with protection of data protection regulation for individuals, especially around things like right to be forgotten. What if that data is involved in U.S. litigation as discovery that explicitly describes that as being important?
Right. One, actually, just as a teaser to that next one, again, the reference to Mad Max Shrem, who brought down the safe harbor regime, has also filed a complaint against the Privacy Shield regime. So there is currently litigation pending that could, in fact, invalidate the Privacy Shield, which has been the basis for data transfers between Europe and the United States from a discovery standpoint. So again, watch that space, and we'll have to see whether that it also has to be revised or renegotiated in due course.
All right.
This may be a niche question, but is there any indication at this point that Britain is going to sort of retain the GDP rules, that they're going to sort of mirror that, or are they going to carve out something separate, completely different, or is there any sort of indication which way they're going to go? Yeah.
So far the UK's regulatory authority, the ICO, has been acting as if it's going to simply adopt the GDPR post-Brexit, and so that is the assumption. I think what's going to be interesting is one of the aspects of GDPR does affect the cross-border transfer of information. Once Brexit occurs, the UK will no longer be under the GDPR umbrella, and so the question of whether they'll maintain those rules so that they'll be recognized as offering equivalent protection for data, or whether they will be going in a different direction, is yet to be resolved. But I think the current thinking is that they will probably continue to track the GDPR requirements.
I'll give you one kind of very visceral ramification of that, which is, and it touches on the cross-border aspects. We think data in the cloud or processing in the cloud. That's not entirely true. That's a nice euphemism, but actually that data and those processors live in a country. They don't float in midair yet. So there's now a push. It used to just be like, oh, well, EU, and well, let's just put everything in UK. Everybody speaks English, closer time zone to at least the East Coast. And that is starting to change. They're starting to say, maybe we'll put it in Ireland. So we are definitely seeing this kind of shift of, you say, oh, I'm putting my stuff in Azure, but then it's Azure where? And not something we said even a year ago. We just said, wherever it's cheap. That's, the cloud. That's not the case anymore.
Let's start building data centers in outer space, and we'll just.
How cool would that be? I'm all over that.
All right. With that, thank you all for your time and your attention. Thanks to our panelists today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.